Esotericism of the inner circle. We have approached the problems of esotericism previously, where it was pointed out with regard to the history of humanity, that the life of humankind, to which we belong, is governed by forces proceeding from two different sources. Firstly, there are planetary influences that act entirely mechanically, and are received by human masses as well as by individual people, quite involuntarily and unconsciously. Then secondly, there are influences proceeding from the inner circles of humanity, whose existence and significance, the vast majority of people no longer suspect or imagine, as is the case largely with planetary influences for the disparages of astrology. The humanity to which we belong, namely the whole of historic and prehistoric humanity, known to science and recorded history, in reality constitutes only the outer circle of humanity, within which there are several other circles or cycles of which we are considered the fifth. One can therefore imagine the whole of humanity, recorded and unknown to us, as consisting of several concentric circles, which total 7 in all. The inner circle is referred to as the esoteric. This circle consists of people who have attained the highest possible development for mankind. Each one of whom possesses individuality in the fullest degree, that is to say, an indivisible I, all forms of consciousness possible for us, full control over these states of consciousness, the whole of knowledge possible for a human being, and a free and independent will. They cannot perform actions opposed to their understanding, nor possess any understanding that is not expressed through actions. At the same time there can be no discord among them, and no difference of understanding, there is no negativity or opposition in this dimension. Their activities are therefore entirely coordinated, and lead to one common aim, without any kind of compulsion, because it is based upon a common and reflected understanding. The next circle is called the mesoteric, which is to say the middle circle, or sixth dimension of potentiality. People belonging to this circle possess all the qualities of the esoteric circle with the sole exception that their knowledge is of a more theoretical nature, which refers to cosmic knowledge. They know and understand a great many things, but these have not yet found expression through their actions, in the fifth dimension. They know more in fact than they do, however their understanding is as precise and exact, and therefore identical with the understanding of the inhabitants of the esoteric circle, or heaven's gate. Between them there can be no discord, there can be no misunderstanding. One understands in the same way they all understand, and all understand in the way that one understands. However, as stated previously, this understanding compared with the understanding of the esoteric circle, is somewhat more theoretical. The third circle is called the exoteric, which is the fifth dimension of actuality. This represents the outer circle, because it is the outer cycle of the inner part of humanity. The people of this circle possess much of that which belongs to people of the esoteric and mesoteric circles, of the level of the sixth and the seventh dimension, however their cosmic knowledge is of a more philosophical nature. Which is to say, it is more abstract than the knowledge of the mesoteric circle. A member of the mesoteric circle calculates, a person of the exoteric circle contemplates. Their understanding may not necessarily be expressed through actions, but there cannot be differences of understanding between them. What one understands, all the others understand. In literature that acknowledges the existence of esotericism, humanity is usually divided into two circles, and the exoteric as opposed to the esoteric is called ordinary life. In reality, however, the exoteric circle is something very far from us, and higher, because in the fifth dimension all that has ever been done, all that has been actualized, ever, is known. At this level of being, one has constant access to soul, or time-body consciousness. Just as someone of the third dimension can read and interpret Google Earth in a reasoned manner, interpreting three-dimensional space. Time-sense involves the interpretation and understanding of all three time dimensions. For ordinary individual, this is already esotericism. The outer circle is the circle of mechanical humanity, to which we belong, and which alone we know. The first sign of this circle is that among people who belong to it, there is not and there cannot be a common understanding. Everybody understands in their own way, and all differently. This circle is sometimes called the circle of the confusion of tongues, that is the circle in which each one speaks in their own particular language, where nobody understands another, and takes no trouble to be understood. In this circle mutual understanding between people is impossible, except in rare and exceptional moments, or in matters having no great significance within the limits of any given being. If people belonging to this circle become conscious of this general lack of understanding, then acquire the desire to understand and be understood, then it means they have an unconscious tendency towards the inner circle, because mutual understanding begins only in the exoteric circle, and is possible there and nowhere else. However, this conscious lack of understanding usually comes to us in an altogether different form. The potential for people to understand depends upon the possibility of penetrating into the exoteric circle, where understanding begins, from a knowledge of all that has ever taken place, all that is happening now, and all that can possibly be. If we imagine humanity in the form of concentric circles, then we can imagine gateways on the circumference of each, through which people of the lesser circle can pass, and thereby lift the veil. The first 4 gateways correspond to the various ways described in this work. The first way is the way of the fakir, the way of people number 1, of those of the physical body, instinctive moving sensory people, without much mind and without much heart. The second way is the way of the monk, the religious way of people number 2, which is of emotional people. The mind and the body are usually not very strong, they lack directed or intended will. The third way is the way of the yogi, of people number 3, and the way of the mind. The heart and the body are usually weak, otherwise they represent an impediment upon this way. Aside from these 3 ways, there is a fourth that exists, through which can pass those who cannot go by any of the first 3 paths. The fundamental difference between the first 3 ways, the way of the fakir, the way of the monk, the way of the yogi, and the fourth way lies in the fact that they are all tied to permanent forms, those that have existed throughout long periods of history, almost without change. Locked and definitive cycles. At the base of these institutions lies religion as we know and understand it. Where schools of yogis exist, they differ little outwardly from religious schools, and throughout history various societies or orders of fakirs have existed, in different countries, as they still exist today. These 3 traditional gateways are permanent ways, within the limits of our historical epochs. 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, there were yet other ways of the 5th and the 6th, which no longer exist today. However, during that period the ways now remaining were not as divided as they are presently, as they stood much closer to one another. The 4th way differs from the old and the new ways, by the fact that it is never a permanent way. It has no definite forms, and there are no institutions connected with it. It appears and disappears, governed by some particular laws of its own. The 4th way is never without some sort of work of a definite significance, it is never without some sort of undertaking, around which and in connection with which, it cannot exist in isolation. When this work is finished, and the aim set before it accomplished, then the 4th way disappears. That is to say, it disappears from that given place, disappears in its given form, continuing perhaps in some other place in another form. Schools of the 4th way exist, for the needs of the work that is being carried out, and in connection with a proposed undertaking. They never exist by themselves as schools, for the purpose of education and instruction. They simply serve as a gateway to the 5th and the 6th. Mechanical help cannot be acquired for any work of the 4th way. Only conscious work can be useful in the undertakings of the 4th. Mechanical man cannot participate in conscious work, which is why the first task of the people who begin such a work is to create conscious assistance. The work and aims of schools of the 4th way can have many forms, and many meanings. In the midst of the ordinary conditions of life, the only chance a person has of finding a way lies in the possibility of their meeting with the beginning of work of this kind. However, the opportunity of meeting with such work, as well as the possibility of profiting by such an encounter, depend upon many circumstances and conditions. The quicker that one grasps the aim of the work that is being executed, the quicker they can become useful to it, and the more they will be able to get something for themselves. However, no matter what the fundamental aim of the work is, the schools continue to exist, only while work is going on. When the work is done, the schools close. The people who began the work leave the stage. Those that have learned from them what was possible to learn, have reached the level of continuing upon the way independently, beginning in one form or another, with their own personal work. It happens sometimes, however, that when a school closes, a number of people are left behind who were around about the work, who saw the outward aspect of it, and saw the whole of the work only in its outward aspect. Having no doubts about themselves, or in the correctness of their conclusions and understanding, they decide to continue the work. To continue this work they form new schools, teach others what they have themselves learned, and give them the same promises that they themselves received. All of this can of course only be outward imitation. However, when we look back on our history, it is almost impossible to distinguish between where the real ends, and the imitation begins. Strictly speaking, therefore, almost everything that we know about various kinds of occult, Masonic and alchemical schools, refer to such imitation. We know practically nothing about real schools, except the results of their work, and even that, only if we are able to distinguish the results of real work from counterfeit and imitation. Such pseudo-esoteric systems, however, also play their part in the work, and the activities of all esoteric circles. They act as intermediaries, between humanity, which is entirely immersed in materialistic life, and schools that are engaged in the education of a certain number of people, as much for the purpose of their own existence, as for any work of a cosmic nature, for this is the beginning of the ascent of the solar suboctave. The very idea of esotericism, and the idea of initiation, reaches people in most cases through pseudo-esoteric systems, or through schools. They represent the outer courtyard. If these were not there, then the vast majority of humanity would have no opportunity to hear, or to learn, of the existence of anything greater than material life, because the truth in its pure form would be inaccessible to them. By virtue of the many characteristics of our being, particularly of contemporary being, truth can only reach us in the form of a lie, as only in this form are we able to accept it. Only in this form are we able to digest and assimilate it. Truth, undefiled, would be for people of this level of being, indigestible or unpalatable food. A grain of truth in an unaltered form can sometimes be found in pseudo-esoteric movements, in church religions, in occult and in theosophical schools. It may be preserved in their writings, their rituals, their traditions, their concepts of the hierarchy, their dogmas or their rules. Esoteric schools, as opposed to pseudo-esoteric schools, that perhaps exist in some countries of the East, are difficult to find, because they exist there in the guise of ordinary monasteries and temples. Tibetan monasteries are usually built in the form of 4 concentric circles, or 4 concentric courts, divided by high walls. Indian temples, particularly those in southern India, are built on the same plan, but in the form of squares, one contained within the other. Worshippers normally have access to the first outer court, and sometimes, as an exception, persons of another religion and European visitors are permitted to enter. Access to the second court is for those of a certain caste only, or for someone having special permission. Access to the third court is for adepts or initiates belonging to the temple. Access to the fourth is only for Brahmins and priests. Organizations of this kind, that are with minor variations, still in existence, enable esoteric schools to exist without being recognized. Out of dozens of monasteries, only one perhaps might actually be a school. But how is it to be recognized? As if we could even get inside, we would only be within the first court, to the second court only pupils have access. However this, we do not know, of course, as the public are only told that they belong to a special caste. With regard the third and fourth courts, one can know nothing about them at all. You can in fact observe the same order in all temples, and until you are told, you cannot distinguish an esoteric temple or monastery from an ordinary one. The idea of initiation that reaches us through pseudo-esoteric systems is also transmitted in completely the wrong form. The legends concerning the outward rites of initiation have been created out of scraps of information that we possess with regard to ancient mysteries. The mysteries represented a particular kind of way, in which, side by side with a difficult and prolonged period of study, theatrical representations of a special kind were given, that depicted in allegorical form the whole path of the evolution of man, and of the world. Transmissions from one level of being to another were marked by ceremonies, or presentations of a special kind, in other words, an initiation. However, a change of being cannot be brought about through any rites at all. Rites can only mark an accomplished transition, and it is only in pseudo-esoteric systems, in which there is nothing else except these rites, that they begin to attribute to the rites some sort of independent meaning. It is supposed that a rite, in being transformed into a sacrament, transmits or communicates certain mystical forces to the initiate. This again unfortunately relates to the psychology of an imitation way. There is not, nor can there ever be, any outward initiation. In reality only self-initiation, self-presentation exists. Systems and schools can indicate methods and ways, however no system or school whatever, anywhere, can do for us the work that we must do for ourselves. Inner growth and a change of being depend entirely upon the work that one must do on themselves. There is absolutely no advocacy and nobody, nowhere makes sacrifices, no matter how great, on our behalf.